Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you're enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you would like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have two tiers of support, $3 per month and $7 per month. So again, our Patreon page is patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. For today's episode, we're gonna talk about the impact of being judgmental. We have talked about this some in previous episodes, but we want to talk about how being judgmental of different aspects of the sport can really have a negative impact, whether that's being judgmental of yourself in your own game, whether that's in terms of your development or in terms of your playing level on a particular day. Also being judgmental of the opponent in terms of their level, their playing style, and what that might mean and the impact of some of that. As well as, being judgmental of other areas of the sport, whether that be of judgmental of mistakes, judgmental of line calls, judgmental of somebody just by looking at them, whatever it may be. But we're going to talk about the impact of all of that, and also suggest some alternatives to that sort of mindset. So when you think about this concept, Brian, what starts to come to mind for you?
Well, this has been a concept, Josh, that's come up a lot lately with some of the players that I work with. And in some regards, they don't even notice that they're being judgmental about these things because much of this, I want to say, is pretty common. And common in that everybody does it. And it's almost accepted as a way of talking, like you said, either about opponents, their level, maybe their style. So using terms like pushers or lobbers, labeling people, right? That's kind of a value judgment in itself. With respect to the score, letting the score be good or bad
Yep.
in itself. And I think what all of this ends up doing is just changing your approach and mindset to what is in front of you. And you begin focusing on things that are out of your control or even things that are more ego oriented in that process. So let's take it as a first example. I thought perhaps we could run through some examples, discuss how people might be judgmental, and then perhaps a different approach to that. So one of the most common ones I hear about is that the level of the opponent that we're playing. And let's start off with the opponent perhaps is not quite as good as us, or at least is that's the rating, that's the results, the UTR, whatever indicates that, for some reason the world or an algorithm thinks they're not quite as good as we are, and then we end up buying into it, or even other people tell us that. So one of the terms that I heard somebody apply recently to a player who was supposedly not as good as them was that this guy is a scrub. And I was really somewhat taken aback by that, although, when you hear that from somebody who is, I don't know, anywhere between 13 and 17, you can't be that surprised. Because I'm sure that that's how players typically talk about each other. And so what are we saying when we call this other player a scrub? Calling them essentially, not a good player. Certainly not as good as you. Maybe even, worse than that. And so, as you said, that can, when we make that judgment, then that can lead to further consequences, like expectations. Well, this player's a scrub, so I should win easily, or I have to win because if I lose to a scrub, what does that do to, my own sense of identity as a, quote unquote, good tennis player? right? Because if they're a scrub, that means I'm not. I'm a good tennis player, and I have to beat the scrub. And so I think when we make that type of judgment, we really pull ourselves out of the moment, and we pull ourselves away from what we need to do today. Now it's become all about my ego and being better than this other person. And I feel like that's a huge distraction toward, again, what you need to do. So I'm just curious, Josh, if you've had, some work with players where you've heard that kind of language, or even if they're just judging, like, oh, I'm supposed to win.
Yeah, I think that happens a lot. And yeah, it might be language like a scrub or oh, this player's not very good or whatever. And I think what can happen is yes, there can definitely be a lot of um, it can be very easy to judge the person, and what that does is you start to overlook them. So if you're playing a player who maybe you've seen and they have a certain playing style, or you look at their rating or ranking and you judge certain things based off of that. Um, I have seen players who start to look past them and they start to think about who would they play next and what what are their chances of going far in the tournament or whatever it is. But rather than staying present and giving the match the seriousness that is required, and especially if they're a certain type of player, more on the consistent side, more on the defensive side, somebody who might be called a pusher. Um, those are the types of players that are often at all levels, I would say, um, can be very difficult to play. And we see, it's also important that we see players like this at every level. And, at the pro level, less certainly, but there are players I would think of like a Gilles Simon or somebody like that who doesn't have the same level of power as somebody else, but they make up for it with their consistency, with their defense, sometimes with their mental steadiness as well. Um, so I think these are the types of players that often are judged and often are maybe overlooked, and that has some serious consequences. That has the consequence of so I think sometimes players will play with a playing style that doesn't that doesn't show a lot of respect towards their opponent. They're disregarding the fact that their opponent plays great defense and can run really well, can get to a lot of balls, and they just stick to their normal game, and then they end up falling behind 2-love, 3-love, and again they've judged that this should be an easy match. I'm supposed to win. And then what does that lead to? That leads to frustration. That leads to anger. That leads to them continuing to not bring their best to the match, right? And I think you brought up a good point earlier, Brian, in terms of trying to really stay present and having that be the goal. That if we are in this situation, oftentimes a player, as we talked about, will start to look towards the future and start to think about winning this match, maybe even starting to think about their next opponent that they may play. Or if they're at, love 3 because they, have started off the match slower, they might be looking towards the past and frustrated about certain things that have happened, but trying to stay present and ask themselves, what's important now? What do they have to do going into this next point? Where do I need to serve? What's my opponent's weakness? What tactics has my opponent been using against me that has put that has allowed the score to be where it is? One of my favorite parts, and I think it's something quite simple from Winning Ugly by Brad Gilbert, which is a book we've talked about quite a bit, is being able to ask yourself the question of who's doing what to who. If you're in a match and the score is 5-2 or it's 3-love or it's you're about to go into the third set, whatever it is, let's be able to ask ourselves who's doing what to who. Why is the score the way it is? What's going on? Is it because of that one line call 4 games ago? Probably not. More often, it's about certain patterns that are being run over and over again. Maybe one person is really, getting into net oftentimes and closing a lot of points out at the net. Maybe one person has one of their wings, their forehand or backhand wing that, where they're hitting way too many errors, and that's part of the issue. Maybe somebody's leaving the ball short and allowing the other person to really take over points. Maybe it's serving. Serving can certainly be a cause of, you know, so something that could really be a difference maker between players of all levels. So trying to ask yourself in a match, what's going on, and then based on that, okay, do I need to make an adjustment in terms of my own playing style, in terms of what I'm trying to do to my, to disrupt my opponent's game. And again, then when we're thinking like that, we're a lot more present. We're in the moment. We're focused on what needs to be done right now, rather than casting these broad judgments on our opponent, maybe belittling them. And I think the other side, and the other side that we haven't really discussed, we've talked more about maybe an opponent that we view to be worse than us. The same exact thing can happen if we're playing somebody that we feel is better than us. Maybe this person has a point 0.7 UTR higher than us, or a point, or whatever it may be, more than a point. We might judge them as being this unbelievable player, this unbeatable force that, of course, we're not going to beat them. They're rated this, or they're the top player in the state, or whatever it is. So it can be, those judgments can go the other way as well, and can have an equally detrimental impact, because we start to second guess or doubt our own abilities, and count ourselves out before the match even starts oftentimes.
Yeah, so that's a good case of a prejudgment then perhaps driving your effort level, or you automatically reduce your fight, and perhaps there's a bit of locker room power involved with that particular matchup. And when we're playing those players who are not quite as good as us, and we're doing those judgments, making those judgments, I think one of the core competitive skills that we're not engaging with is respect. We have to respect everybody that we play. And I think that's something that when we're talking about the opponents is a key skill, that even if we're judging their level, if we're judging their style, if we're judging their reputation, some level of disrespect is probably going to factor in there. So, when we're judging their level as not as good as ours, disrespect comes out in maybe assuming we're going to win, but then by not giving our full focus, that's actually a decrease in effort. So we're essentially saying, I don't need to bring my full best today because you're not as good as me. If it's about opponent's style, they're a pusher or they're a lobber, and very often you'll hear, especially younger players, talk about how that's not quote unquote real tennis. Well, if you look at the rules of the game, it doesn't say you can't hit moonballs or lobs or be consistent. And so when we use, negative terms like pusher or lobber or whatever, you're showing, again, disrespect for that person's way of playing. But as you noted, Josh, that way of playing is used at all levels of the game and is very effective. When we think about ways of pressuring opponents, consistency is like one of the foundational levels. You noted, Gilles Simon. You could look at even David Ferrer as being someone that way. Simona Halep could be considered as someone who plays that style, right? They're minimizing errors. That puts pressure on opponents. That's not something for you to denigrate. It's something for you to understand that, hey, that's how they play the game. So I think when it comes to judging opponents, again, either their level, their style, or their reputation. Maybe they have a reputation for poor behavior, poor line calls, etc. If you've never played that person, you don't necessarily have direct experience with some of those things. And if you bring a negative judgment to the court, you might make it worse by default, not only in your own mind, but when something happens. So I think one of the ways that we can learn to be more in the moment, to accept what is going on, is notice, first of all, that we're making some judgments. And the judgments could be about good or bad, or it could be, again, about reputation or style, real or not real, something. There's some sort of binary choice that we could be making with respect to a judgment. And instead, can we just accept that what is, and take it on instead as a challenge? In past episodes, we have used this quote from Carlos Castaneda, call it the warrior mindset. And I'll use the quote again because I think this is a great way of looking at every situation in tennis. And the quote is, the difference between an ordinary person and a warrior is that a warrior takes everything as a challenge, while the ordinary person takes everything as a blessing or a curse. And so that last piece is important. Blessing or a curse is really good or bad. Some sort of binary choice of this or that. When instead, can we just look at whatever is in front of us? It is what it is. Can I now accept this situation and approach it from a challenge mindset? Where, okay, I'm playing this player who is a point above me, a point below me. How could I challenge myself to perform at my best here? So that it's not about my ego and having to beat this other player or having this player beat me. Maybe I can get a respectable score. It brings us down to the moment. What do I need to do in this moment? So by embracing that warrior mentality, embracing everything as just challenge, it helps you focus back on what you want to do. And both of those situations, Josh, are normal. If you're a competitive player, you're going to play people who are not quite as good as you. So, great opportunity to practice being great at that situation. You're going to play people who are better than you. Again, a great opportunity to embrace that situation, see how your game measures up, and can you do some things to make them work harder? And of course, you're going to be playing in your zone, sort of that, I would say, plus or minus, let's use UTR. Most people are familiar with that probably. Plus or minus, say, 0.75. It's kind of in your zone, right? Maybe 0.5. Those are normal situations. Can you get really good at playing those opponents? And now we're looking at, again, this is more like the learning journey we spoke of in our last episode. I wanted to touch on what you said with respect to the score and who's doing what to whom. And you did mention that one of the options is maybe no adjustment. Right? 2-5, one break, perhaps. One break may not be a big deal. Maybe the break that they got on you was a little bit lucky. I was talking to a player the other day who was describing to me a set in which it was 2-all. Opponent got a little bit lucky with some net cord returns and ended up breaking on a deuce point. So he was down 2-4. And I was really proud of this player because he thought about the situation and he realized I actually don't need to change anything. I just need to continue to be myself. And I'm going to trust that if I'm just myself, point after point after point, the result will turn out well for me. So he made that kind of, that analysis that you talked about. Hey, who's doing what to whom? And he came up with what I thought was a very good conclusion. I don't need to panic. I just need to continue to do what I do. He broke right back and then won the set 6-4. So he ended up, just by refocusing there in that moment, not putting too much drama on the score, and getting himself to 6-4. And the nice thing with this player is that this isn't the first time he's done that. He's learned to trust his A game more and more and more. And because he's gotten more practice at it. And he, the last time we spoke, he's like, yeah, every time it gets to 4-all or 3-all, I notice that my opponents start to feel the pressure more than I do. And they make more mistakes. And I just end up winning the set by just being solid and being myself. And so being judgmental of the score can also take you out of the moment because you may think that a change is necessary when maybe it's not a change in tactics that are necessary, but perhaps a refocus on who you are and just being a little bit better at what you do.
Totally. No, I like that because yeah, that change can can look differently, right? It could be a change of tactics that's needed, but as you said, there can be many reasons why the score is the way it is, and oftentimes also, somebody it takes somebody some time to get into a good rhythm in a match, right? So somebody starts off the match slowly. It might not. It often is not a matter of an issue in tactics or strategy. It often is, okay, I need to get to a point where I'm feeling the ball well, where I find that rhythm, and then at that point things tend to sort themselves out. And I think, yeah, in general, we want to be able to get to a point where we're able to view these situations that we're in, and as we've talked about, they're inevitable. You will play players that are ranked and rated higher than you, and you will play players ranked and rated lower than you. But if you have the type of attitude where I'm trying to give every match, the every opponent the due respects that's required, I'm trying to get a lot out of this match and learn a lot from it. That's the type of attitude that ultimately leads to us improving, right? The player that you were talking about, Brian, I'm sure if they had the mentality that oh, I'm at 2-4, what am I doing? This is, ridiculous. I should be winning this match. Then they're not thinking about what they actually have to do to turn that scoreline around. So I think, and also this is where I think having a journal, having a system to reflect on our matches can be really helpful. Having there's an exercise. I think we've talked about it, but maybe not. It's called 3-2-1 exercise that I've done with a lot of players. I definitely not something I came up with, but it's 3-2-1. It's three things that you did well, two things that you want to improve upon, and one thing that you learned. And starting to get into the habit of doing that for matches, for training, starts to put things into perspective. Starts to help you, first of all, come up with a system of helping you learn from your matches, learn from practice, learn from those experiences that you have, but also helps, there can be a day where you felt like nothing went well, or days where maybe you feel like things are going super well. But being able to have that system where there's always things that did go well, always things that you want to improve upon and learn from, uh, can really help with that development process because you're able to see the bigger picture. It's not, we can have a day where we lose and we had some double faults and that overshadows everything. But instead, trying to get to a point where, yes, that's one of those things that we want to improve upon, or maybe there's some learning there, but there's also a lot that went well, and trying to use some sort of tool like that to help us get to a point of being able to reflect and understand and hopefully learn from our matches, so that we can start to notice patterns, right? As you're talking about with that player, starting to notice that at 3-3, 4-4, somewhere around there, certain things start to happen. If you have the way to reflect on matches, whether they went, quote unquote, well or not, then you can start to pick up on some of these habits, patterns, and learn from them. Where instead, if not, you're sort of relying on your that default state of, um, this match didn't go so well. I don't, a lot of players after maybe a match that didn't go so well, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to necessarily reflect on it. So getting to the point where we can take, these matches, whether they're against players of any sort of ranking or rating, whatever our judgments are going into it. And maybe that's something that we want to take note of as well. What were some of my judgments that I had going into the match or during the match as well? And what sort of impact did that have? And again, that can make it a little bit easier to learn from them.
The reflection thing has actually been something that particular player has done very, very well. And I think as you described it, that's what he's done to realize this part of about his game, and he's gotten that insight that we often get um, through that reflection. And for him, he doesn't always do it written, but he will often do it with his practice partners or teammates, and they'll talk through it, and the questions will go back and forth. And that's why it's great if you can have that relationship with someone where you're not that you're competing with each other, not against each other. That you can see yourselves as partners on this journey, not as threats to each other. Um, and so I bring up that word threat because it goes well with challenge. We had that episode on mental fortitude in tennis, and we talked a lot about threats versus challenges. And threats are often, the biggest threat that we feel as tennis players is to the threat to our identity. We all have a sense, for the most part, that we're good tennis players, and the things that happen out on the court can challenge that or be a threat to that. So I'm curious, Josh, if we could dive in a little bit more on the challenge side and what perhaps some of your thinking with respect to challenges has evolved over the last few months since we've gone into it more in detail. But when you think of helping players instill a challenge mindset with respect to some of these situations, what's some of your advice to them?
It's a good question. I mean, I think trying to get to that point where we embrace this situation, whether that's as we've talked about, whether that's a situation of playing a really strong player, playing not so strong players, but also there's a lot more that can be embraced and that can we where we can really try to take that challenge on, whether that's an injury, right? A player is not able to play for a while and then is coming back and maybe feeling frustrated by their level or starting to think back to the injury itself. Can we challenge ourselves to, or can we help that player challenge themselves to understand that this really can be a great opportunity for them? Can we help them understand that, everybody goes through things and how there's a lot of learning that can be done here, and how we handle this situation can ultimately help us in future situations where we have a setback or an injury. So I think a big part of it is getting to that point of embracing. There's a great video on YouTube. It's from Jocko Willink, if some people are familiar. I believe the title is good, just good, and the idea is something happens at work, at school, on the tennis court, wherever, and getting to that point where we can say good, and this is a chance for us to embrace it, get better, learn from the situation, even situations that we would typically view as negative. It also reminds me a little bit of a story or a proverb, and I'm sure I won't have all the details of this perfectly, but I think people will get the gist. Um, the idea is there's a man, and oh, do I even want to try to? Oh, I'll try. So there's a man, and he has a son, right? And all of a sudden, there's these horses come into the town, and so they he gets one of the horses, and he gets one of the horses, he gives it to his son, and people in the town, they say, oh, that's great, you got this this horse for your son. And he said, we'll see. And turns out a few days later, the boy falls off of the horse, um gets breaks his leg, and everyone's saying, oh, that's so horrible, I'm so sorry about your son's leg. And he says, yeah, we'll see. And then something else happens. I think the town ends up going to war, and the boy's not able to fight in the war because of his broken leg. And everyone says, or the man says, we'll see. And it sort of keeps going on like that, where something that most people would view as positive happens, and the man says, we'll see, and something happens negative. And I think the point of this is that we never actually know the impact that something will have, right? Something down the line, whether we view that sort of as the butterfly effect, or however we want to view it. Something happens, and that sort of leads to this cascade of consequences, where if we can get past this point of being judgmental and judging every instance as simply good or bad, and more just take what happens as it is, try to learn from it, try to grow from it, and move on, keeping some of these lessons and learnings in mind, I think it's a much better attitude towards trying to be that best player that we can be, as we've talked about. Where instead, if we're constantly, viewing things as good or bad and judging, which again, most, I think everybody has that side of them. Everybody does that at times. It leads to a lot more ups and downs. I find it leads to a lot more of, okay, I'm playing great right now. Okay, I'm in a slump right now, and emotionally sort of riding that similar roller coaster. But if we can, be more accepting of some of these things, be more accepting that your game will have moments where, over the long period of time where there are slumps, and your game will have times where you're playing great and you're feeling the ball really well and you're winning those close matches, and other times where maybe those close matches aren't going your way. And even within a match, the fact that we've talked about, even the top players in the world win somewhere around 53 to 55% of their points, right? That they're going to win and lose a lot of points along the way. That, if we can normalize all of this and be accepting of all of this, we can start to move past this point of being judgmental. And we've talked a lot about being judgmental of ourselves and being judgmental of the opponent, but also, not being judgmental of circumstances as they appear, whether it's within a match, whether it's more long term, but being accepting of that, understanding that that's normal. And I think a big, something that helps with this is trying to, really be a student of the game, try to learn about, other learn about pro players and their journeys. You see, I think I can think of um, most top players, most players that have gotten to the top of the game have had setbacks along the way. I mean, I think about Nadal and every injury that he's had, and how, these setbacks that he's had in his life, and how he's continued to come back time and time again. Or Djokovic, how he's had some significant setbacks. I remember maybe 2017, somewhere around 2018, maybe somewhere around 5 years ago, his ranking had dropped. He was outside of the top 10, and again made his way back. I know he had an injury at the time, but again, think about Andre Agassi. He was, I think, ranked like 120, 140 in the world, and there were some reasons for that. But again, made his way back. Serena, I know, also had certain setbacks, in her career. Serena and Venus as well. Setbacks, and understanding that what makes a player great, part of what makes a player great, is that ability to come back time and time again from whatever setbacks and be resilient. And learning about some of these players and their situations, I think can help players get to that point of being accepting, and sort of keeping the perspective that these ups and downs, these trials and tribulations are all normal, or are all part of a sort of quote unquote normal tennis journey. And if we can embrace them, if we can get to that point of viewing them as opportunities for growth, then where it's a lot easier to really make those strides. Where if we're stuck in our own heads, frustrated about these situations, feeling like it's unfair, or why me, or, you know, comparing ourselves to other people that are maybe playing better in that moment, then it's a lot harder to grow from these experiences.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there, Josh. And one of the things that you had said um, made me think of the word just like attitude. Can we learn to, through this approach of trying to be more non-judgmental about it, can we develop attitudes that are more in line with reality? You said normalize. And I think normalize also is a way of understanding, yes, these things are normal, they happen. They're essentially reality. Some of the realities of tennis are you will lose a lot of points. You will make a lot of mistakes. Um, some of that is not all that important at certain times. What is important? So the more that we understand some of these judgments are more denying reality. Like, you don't need to win every point. The sport of tennis actually allows you to be amazingly imperfect and still win. But so many of us bring an attempt to be perfect attitude toward the winning and losing of points, which is really denying how the sport works, how the scoring system works. And I think that's one area where, if we're going to study tennis, really try to understand how the scoring system works. How do you actually win two sets? What does it take? What's the attitude that it takes for handling winning and losing of points in games and sets, so that eventually you can get two sets out of that. Um, and so when you begin to understand what reality is, then you can bring a better attitude toward each of these situations in which you, in the past, may have made judgments. So instead of looking at someone as not a good player or a really good player, okay, what is a more productive attitude for me to have so that I can embrace this situation, so that I can then bring myself to that moment. So it can be an embrace the challenge, or it can be something else. But we want to start looking at all of these situations: opponent level, opponent style, the score, how we make mistakes, as opportunities for growing our game. And this really goes back to our last episode, Josh, which I think is so key, but also difficult to do, is if we are prioritizing mastery of the sport over a long-term period of time, learning from every experience, we want to understand, how does reality work in a sport like tennis, and how can I embrace whatever's happening now and turn it into an opportunity for me to be better, to learn more about myself, to learn more about my game. And I'll use that player I was just talking about as a bit of inspiration. He's gone from somebody who has had a lot of judgmental stuff going on, and just over the course of, I want to say, 6 months, is now starting to realize what I just told you about, that he's trusting his game point by point and letting it play out, and he's being rewarded with more wins. But he's doing it because he's not focusing on winning. He's not focusing on the consequences of winning and losing. He's focusing more on trusting himself in the moment and seeing how that plays out. So I think when asking listeners what can they do about moments in which they are judgmental, because they will continue to occur. We all have that. Is, can we switch quickly to some more productive attitude, to looking at, okay, what's the opportunity here? How could I challenge myself here? What's the reality of this situation? And then begin to craft that attitude, and begin to build more facilitative emotions so that you can perform in that moment. I like your story, and I know I've heard that, and it does go like a few different levels, right? Because he was able to stay home from the war, and people saying, well, isn't he lucky, and that type of thing, right? And there are multiple things that go on there. And the idea also of, I think, of that story is, there are many things out of our control that could happen to us. And the more that we are of just accepting whatever is happening and dealing with those circumstances in the moment, the better. Treating things as good or bad tends to be distracting to how we employ our energy and our thoughts. So it's kind of like a tennis match. There's a lot of things you can't control going on out there, because you're interacting with one other person, or in the case of doubles, a doubles team. You have some influence over that, but not complete. So lots of things are going to happen out of your control. Can you just take it moment by moment and not judge it as good or bad? And I think the more that players can bring themselves to terms with trying not to use terms like good or bad, or other terms that are with respect to level or style, and just accept them for what they are. Everything is legit. Everything, this is all reality. How can I best deal with this? So on my journey, when I face these situations again, because everything we have talked about here will continue to come up, we want to be able to handle them better and better. We don't want to get stuck calling everybody a scrub or a pusher, and then struggling with that particular situation for years. But if you don't change how you approach those situations, the experience will continue to be the same.
Totally, totally. And again, I think most people have been there. Most people have been judgmental towards opponents or maybe overlooked opponents. But can we get to that point of growing and moving past that? And again, tennis is a lifetime sport, is something that, if your body allows it, you can play for a very, very long amount of time. So can we learn from the experiences and also notice the impact? Notice how is my game when I have these expectations of myself to beat this player because I've judged them and their abilities in the past. How is my can I notice how my game and how my attitude and how relaxed I feel when I go in more with an open mindset, like let's see what happens here. Maybe this player is, really strong, right? Maybe that player is rated or ranked lower, but is having a great day. You need to face whoever is on the other side of the court that day from you. Just like your level fluctuates and attitude fluctuates, so does your opponent. They're human as well. And you need to face whoever happens to be on the other side of the net from you on that particular day, not some notion of who this person is based on some algorithm or based on a ranking, or based on what somebody told you, from their match against them a year ago. You need to face whoever's on the other side of the court from you, and you need to figure out, how manage the situation, figure out how to be a little bit better than that person on that day, rather than sort of playing the match out ahead of time beforehand based on some of these judgments. You need to be present enough to handle the situation, handle your own game, handle whatever the opponent is throwing at you, understand the different dynamics. As we talk about the different levels of tennis IQ, and understanding these different levels, these different aspects of it, help to give you the best possible chance and help you be the best competitor that you can be, because you're trying to do everything in your power to be successful.
Yeah. So I think a couple of episodes we could also point to strengthen some of the things that we are discussing today. One would be our episode on mental fortitude in tennis, where we discussed a lot about the challenge mindset. And even though we didn't bring up this topic or word today, Josh, we both know that one way to cultivate the skill of being non-judgmental is through mindfulness meditation. So our episode on mindfulness would also be helpful, because that's some off the court stuff that you can do that will help you not make so many judgments, or even if you do, the impact emotionally will be less and less as you get better at this, as you develop a calmer mind when things occur, when you develop an ability to quiet your mind and bring your attention to the things that we're discussing today, or bring your attention to the what's important now, to being in the moment. So I think perhaps we could even put that in the show notes, just as some links to some past episodes to refer to. So, well, that's our show for today. So thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check us out on Instagram. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiq/membership. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.